I'd like to introduce our third speaker. It's Kai Wallace, who's from AOC Archaeology. We'll be talking about the ins and outs of an Iron Age palisade at West Craigs.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kai Wallace, and I'm also going to be talking about the West Craigs area, but more specifically West Craigs Farm, which produced evidence from the Neolithic through to the early historic period. So the focus of the talk is going to be about the palisade enclosure, but we will be discussing features from the other periods as well. So the post-ex works have been carried out, and the site is due to be published in the Scottish Archaeological Journal next year. So if you're after some more detailed information, then search it out. So I'm going to throw in a caveat straight away. This job happened right at the start of COVID. So the site was immediately shut down and abandoned for a few months. So please excuse any vegetation you may see in the back of these images. And there's also a lack of spectacular final aerial shot of the site. So bear with me, please. So the works were prompted ahead of a residential development by Taylor Wimpey East. And they were part of a wider scheme of development on the western limit of Edinburgh City, immediately next to the airport. So West Craigs site, which you can see highlighted in red, sits perched upon a narrow hillock, surrounded by lower lying ground, which hopefully you can see in some of the images has changed drastically over the last few years from nice agricultural ground to a large building site. These aerial images also show the level of archaeological investigation across the area, with you can see in that lower left image massive evaluation trenches and some topsoil strip areas, some of which Christina's just talked about. And you can just make out the palisade area that we'll be talking about in the big stripped out area in the bottom. So if we look at some of the images available on Google Earth, for instance, hopefully you can get a sense of the elevated position of West Craigs in relation to the surrounding landscape and some nearby relevant sites. So crop mark sites are prevalent in the area, such as the ditched fort at Gogar in the top right-hand photo, which is presumed to be Iron Age. So two relatively recent excavations near West Craigs also suggest further rich prehistoric landscapes such as Gogar Mains, which produced Neolithic pits, bronze and Iron Age hut circles, two phases of palisade and a very large early historic corn drying kiln. Also Maybury Park, which is very close to the site, was a multi-phase prehistoric open settlement which also produced a possible prehistoric trackway. Obviously the site Christina's just talked about as well. So also, within the airport area, which is very close by, we have the early historic cat stain and associated Longkiss Cemetery. Further north, we have sites like Camel Fort and Craigie Hill Settlement, which the latter, which is believed to be early medieval in origin. To the west, at Newbridge Roundabout, you have Hooley Hill Bronze Age Mound, as well as the Iron Age cart burial, which was dated to the 5th century BC. We have temporary Roman camps kind of spread around the area as well, located to the south, and also in the wider area you have the scheduled monuments such as Dalmahoy and Kames Hill forts. So AOC's involvement at West Craigs began with 50 trial trenches, which revealed a lot of undulating ground due to the presence of extensive bedrock outcrops, which created some very shallow areas and also some very deep areas filled in with hill wash. Area C, which is in the top right image there, was the focus of activity. It's positioned on a nice level hilltop at about 60 metres above sea level. It's where we identified the palisade in 5 trenches, and also a cluster of small post holes found in one trench to the southwest, which was sat in the area of hillwash. In total, we stripped 1.52 hectares of ground, which we excavated between February, March and June 2020, obviously interrupted by COVID. So I'm quickly going to touch upon some of the activity predating the palisaded enclosure. So in a smaller area to the south of the site was Area D, which produced a hearth pit, which was flanked by 2 post holes, and it was positioned on a small plateau overlooking a kind of boggy area. So the pit, as you can see in the photo there, was clearly used for burning, and it contained 3 Neolithic Fengate vessel shards, which are shown illustrated in the top right image there. The pit was dated to the early Neolithic, which fits in really nicely with the accepted date range for the use of Fengate pottery in England, but also potentially slightly predates its known presence in Scotland, which is currently accepted as 3300 BC. This was the only Neolithic activity we found at West Craigs during our works, but it's comparable to other small-scale Neolithic activity in proximity, including Goggermains and Maybury Park. So moving back to Area C on the hilltop and into the Bronze Age, we hit multiple features which are located slightly downslope from the palisade, buried in deeper soils. The clusters of features were pretty truncated, so it was difficult to identify clear plans, but we tentatively identified 3 structures, 4, 5 and 6, based on the density of some of these features. Structures 4 and 6, which are circled there, they could easily have been the remnants of circular structures, whereas structure 5 appeared more irregular. So 2 dates were obtained from the associated features from postal near structure 4 and the central pit in structure 5, which give contemporary dates in the early Bronze Age between the 25th and 23rd centuries BC, so early Bronze Age. Another linear nearby, dated slightly later in the 21st to the 18th centuries BC. So close by to these possible structures were large pits containing relatively high quantities of hulled barley, one of which produced a date range of 12th to 10th century BC. So the dated pit, which is the top right image there, that shows multiple deposits of burnt silt, sand, charcoal, large cattle bones, and some fragments of pot and a single whetstone. Interestingly, during the post-ex works, fragments of fired clay from the pit were interpreted as the remnants of an object known as a toyer. I may have pronounced that incorrectly. A toyer is related to metalworking activities, specifically for directing the airflow into a hearth or a furnace, perhaps. So clearly, we have a focus of activity in this lower lying area throughout the Bronze Age, based on the dates, although probably episodically rather continuous. So moving into the Iron Age now. Now for anyone who isn't familiar with the term palisade, in archaeological terms, it's a type of structure used to demarcate a space by constructing a physical feature such as a wooden boundary, which I think is nicely shown in these 2 reconstruction images here. Palisade enclosure is seen across northern Europe from at least the 3rd millennium BC, and we have evidence of it running into the early historic period, but it's particularly common in Scottish later prehistory. So the construction of a palisade would have initially involved the cutting of a narrow ditch, or trench, or a possible post-hole circuit, which to form a foundation where the timber posts would be placed to then form a large fence boundary. So they are often identified as circular or oval crop marks through aerial photography, but they may also be underrepresented in the archaeological record, being kind of fairly ephemeral, especially where modern ploughing has been happening as well. Palisade enclosures can be quite varied, with elaborated entrances, multiple circuits, and internal features. They're usually considered to be farmsteads or settlements, sometimes associated with roundhouses, but they're also commonly labelled stock enclosures, generally where there seems to be, they are devoid of internal features. So now looking at the West Craigs palisades, it was constructed on the most elevated and level portion of the site, overlooking a vast expansive landscape, kind of with 360 views. It was subcircular in plan. The palisade ditch survived to a length of 110 metres, potentially enclosing an area of at least 2,000 square metres. The majority of the feature was cut through sandy clay natural and measured on average just under half a metre deep and about 0.7 metres on average in width. You will see the northern portion of the feature is missing, which left a gap of about 45 metres across from our slots, which is assumed to be lost to modern truncation, which may relate to the insertion of a very large drain that was put in just to the north. So these section images show how well constructed the palisade was, with typical steep sloping sides and a flat base for the foundation trench. Many of the 13 slots we dug showed large packing stones still preserved in upright positions along the trench edge. Which suggests some of the posts may have rotted in situ, while in other sections high volumes of large oak charcoal suggest possible burning of structural posts or stakes. These well-preserved sections also give us a good idea of the width of the posts used for the palisades, and in some slots the use of stone post pads, which you can see in the top left image. Also, given the substantial volume of packing stones in some areas, post settings could also be clearly seen in plan as areas devoid of stone, which are presumably where the largest of the posts were positioned. Kind of just to try and put that in context with the post system, at Broxmouth near Dunbar, so the earliest phase of activity there, they think, is the palisades phase, which was just slightly larger than the West Craigs example, but they estimated it to contain a minimum of 500 posts measuring about 2 metres in height. So that should hopefully give you kind of an idea of the size of these structures. On the western side of the feature was a well-defined entrance, which was present as 2 termini spaced 2 metres apart and cut almost entirely through bedrock, which you can see in the top left image there. This is interesting, given it was almost the only part of the enclosure that was cut through rock, which possibly suggests an intentional and practical consideration by the builders to keep the integrity of the entrance when people are coming in and out of the enclosure. Both of the termini contained 2 posts, much larger than the general size of the other posts that we think were throughout the palisade, suggesting they housed very large straining posts as part of a large gated system as well. So this type of exaggerated terminus is quite common in palisades, such as sites as Kilduthel in Inverness and Dryburn Bridge near Dunbar. In terms of ecofactual material, the palisade ditch, the soil contents were very low. In fact, I think from 120 sample litres, we only had 6 macroplant fragments. And apart from only occasional larger chunks of oak, only 51 tiny pieces of bone were identified, which we think were cattle bone. So while that is probably the acidic soil conditions at play, it probably also confirms that the actual formation of this feature, the cutting and then the formation, was obviously a rapid and singular event. However, amongst the mass of large packing stones were various workstone implements, presumably discarded during the palisade's construction. And these included a grinding and rubbing stones and items representing weight and whirl roughouts and a heavily used pounder. We did recover 2 really nice cannel coal items, one which was within the entrance terminal on the left there, and the second was found in a bedrock crevice behind the palisade, which is the blue star on the right-hand side. Interestingly, both these items are believed to they're both bangle roughouts at similar production stages, but they're of slightly different shale types, which obviously may suggest different sources. These items are they're cannel coal is quite a common item found on later prehistoric sites, but they're rarely found in securely dated contexts like we have at West Craigs. Potentially, our star find is the item directly below the plan there, which is a socketed gouge. So the gouge was pretty corroded, but it survived intact, and it was displayed a circular closed socket with short curving blade, and would likely have had a wooden handle originally, which could have been hit by a mallet. So the gouge would have been part of a prehistoric toolkit, predating the saw, from the same group of tools as axes and chisels, so quite capable of manipulating wood for making curved cuts or recesses, for example. Gouges are commonly found in England and Wales during the Iron Age and the Romano-British periods, but significantly less so in a Scottish context. So a few examples that we know about in Scotland include a hoard that was dated to the mid-2nd century AD, found near Coburn's Path in the Scottish borders. That's the image to the right of our socketed gouge. So obviously the discovery of an item like that from West Craigs in itself is significant, and even more special if it was actually associated with the construction or the maintenance of the palisade itself. So inside the palisade, we identified 3 possible structures, all of which were quite different in comparison. Structures 1 and 2 appeared as kind of ring ditch gullies containing post holes, which seemed to be demarcating the extents of a small number of pits. Structure 2 was probably the best survived, but still lacked in terms of layout and size to be kind of called an actual roundhouse, whereas the multiple linear and curvilinear ditches associated with Structure 1, they may suggest periodical extensions or broadening of a structure's footprint, perhaps. The third structure, 3, was closer to the entrance, but was again markedly different and lacked any kind of gully, like the other 2 structures, but was formed of multiple posts, possibly forming an arc. But again, the projected post ring would be way smaller than a typical roundhouse. But as is often the case where modern agriculture is present, we're only left with the deepest surviving features, which obviously can leave incoherent patterns. But so it makes it difficult to define their form and function, obviously. But what is clear is that these structures signify focused activity within the palisade and produce typical domestic material, including pot, charcoal, burnt bone, and hulled barley, although in very, very low quantities. So to the southern side of was another small curvilinear, which appeared to have been partially cut into the palisade trench at one end. The curvilinear trench may represent the outline of a smaller fence system for use as a small stock enclosure, perhaps. And also within the smaller enclosed area was a substantial linear cut, which is the bottom right image there, which appeared to kind of further divide up this smaller space. So, and it was also located to a small square 4-post structure, which you can just see in tiny little dots next to it. And this 4-posters are a common occurrence on Iron Age sites, with interpretations generally agreeing on an agricultural function, such as a granary or a raised platform, which obviously fits the idea of a small agricultural enclosure. So the dates that we have available, 3 dates obtained from the palisade, which are circled in the red circle there. They suggest the same actual age, which obviously places the use of the palisade between the 8th and 5th centuries BC. Similarly, a date from the linear associated with Structure 1 produced the same date range as the palisade and was the only contemporary dated feature. The gully from Structure 2 dated 1st century BC to 3rd century AD, obviously making it much later than the original palisade phase and marking the next phase of activity inside the enclosure. 2 dates obtained from the small enclosure were broadly similar to Structure 2 at 1st to 3rd and 2nd to 4th centuries AD. And finally, 2 dates from Structure 3 were slightly later again at 2nd to 4th and 3rd to 6th century AD. So obviously the available dates suggest we have evidence of episodic activity, but over a protracted period with a gap of multiple centuries between the palisade construction and subsequent construction of Structure 2. And then there appears to be a degree of overlap between the use of Structure 2, the smaller enclosure ditch, and then Structure 3. And if we look at the plan and location of Structures 2 and 3 and the smaller enclosure, they're neatly inside the palisade area, but despite being significantly later than the actual palisade phase, I don't think it's that inconceivable that the palisade outline was actually used by the later communities as an extent or a boundary, especially towards the eastern side, which is in the 2 right-hand images, where the palisade packing stone had actually survived quite mounded even after topsoil stripping. So moving beyond the Iron Age and outside the enclosure, we excavated some large pits clustered on the eastern side of the bedrock ridge, which is in the kind of lower right-hand side of the plan, which appears to be an area of active, early historic activity. So some of these features could easily represent corn drying features based on high levels of hulled barley and large alder charcoals, which were found during the analysis of the soil samples, which could easily suggest wooden superstructures for the drying process. So these included the pit shown in the bottom image there, which contained multiple little stake holes cut into its base, and it also contained over 1,200 cereal grains, one which was dated 5th to 7th century AD. Also, another feature nearby was a short windbreak feature, which seemed to be like enclosing a pit, which was dated 6th to 7th century AD. And finally, although not dated, a large pit also close by was contained a very well preserved rotary quern and large quantities of roundwood alder again, which again could represent structural elements such as stakes for a wicker screen. So while there is some evidence of serial exploitation from the Bronze Age features that we found at West Craigs, there's an almost disappearance within the Iron Age contexts. And then in contrast that with the early historic features, there's a massive increase again in cereal presence at the site, especially hulled barley. So this shift mirrors a broader trend in crop exploitation from the late Iron Age into the early historic period, which across Scotland, which is also evidenced in the nearby landscape at Gogher Mains, for example. So how does West Craigs Palisade compare with other excavated sites? Well, in terms of its construction, there are multiple sites dating to a similar period, which signify the spread of palisade construction in northern England and southern Scotland. Ravelrig Quarry, which is the top left image there, is found at the Ravelrig Quarry was 7 kilometres from the site, and it produced dates from similar to the 8th to the 5th centuries BC, and then another date of 7th to 5th, also within an associated roundhouse. White Creek Palisade in Dumfries, again dated slightly earlier, but also within the 8th to 5th centuries BC. But its roundhouse was dated slightly later than the actual palisade construction. Nearby at Gogher Mains Palisade, one date that they produced was dated 9th to 8th century, so potentially very late Bronze Age, very early Iron Age. With a nearby hut circle, which not inside the palisade, just to the outside of it, which dated slightly later, a few centuries later actually. We have Blackford Palisade in Perthshire, again 8th to 5th century BC, with 2 associated roundhouse, and this is also very similar date to an oak plank which was recovered from the Braehead enclosure, which in west of Scotland, which was a large cannel coal production site. In East Lothian, at Broxmouth, the palisade phase dated 7th to 5th centuries, which was similar to its nearest neighbour, Dryburn Bridge, which both of these were interpreted as predating the first roundhouse constructions. The palisade sites such as Dryburn, Broxmouth and Braehead, they appear to be the founding acts of enclosure at these sites, subsequently going on to develop onto larger ditched enclosures and protracted settlements, which does not seem to be the case at West Craigs. Obviously, the West Craigs enclosure is quite large compared to some of these other palisade sites, especially the ones that actually feature really well-defined roundhouses, such as Ravelrig and Blackford there. Whereas larger palisade sites such as Mirehead, Whitecrook and Gogher, they only produce traces of features inside in the enclosure, which has led their excavators to suggest either stock enclosure function, or that the structures were actually just of a flimsy nature and have only left a scant traces. So where does that leave West Craigs then? Well, the palisade phase is obviously certainly distinct compared to the other features, and there's a significant lack of dated contemporary features, either inside or outside the enclosure, to suggest any sort of real long-term settlement inside, which obviously during this phase, other than the bare bones of structure one. So obviously also the initial enclosure was a substantial structure based on the size of the trench, the volume of packing material and its large entrance. So it was clearly built to keep things in and out, and it was obviously certainly built to last. It's also very plausible that it was an agricultural enclosure with a single house, which could have been structure one, which was abandoned after a relatively short phase. But it also may be the case that further internal structures related to the early phase were once present but have simply been erased through later occupation or subsequent modern agriculture. So lastly, West Craigs site and the archaeological features that it produced are kind of like a microcosm of the wider landscape through time, with evidence from multiple periods and different forms in almost pocketed areas on the site. But it's really the early part of the Iron Age where communities they really make their mark on the site by building what must have been a prominent and very visible monument to the surrounding communities. And this is obviously during a time at the start of the early Iron Age where communities were settling more upland areas such as West Craigs. Thanks for listening.